This is my dual Xeon E5 2670 build with 64 gigabytes of RAM. The processors, $120 on eBay. So here's our situation. We've got a server that's basically been retired and had some super crap Xeon E5 2600 CPUs. We've already pulled the CPUs, we've popped our new 2670s in. Now we need to reapply the thermal paste and reinstall our heat sinks. Then once we've made sure that everything is working and operational, we're going to transplant our CPUs and motherboard out of this server case, which is a Norco, 25 drive, something or other from a long time ago, into this new Corsair 780T. Now this Corsair 780T is a great case for this, although strictly speaking, the motherboard that we're using here, the Asus Z9, does not fit. So we need to go into DIY mode for a second. Now a quick note about these heat sinks. These heat sinks are server heat sinks. They're made for very loud airflow. They're made for building a compact server, so like a server that's only 2 or 3 rack units tall. If you're going to do this, I would suggest replacing these, but because I don't care, I'm going to keep using these heat sinks. But if you're having to get new heat sinks, don't get heat sinks like these. Get actual reasonable heat sinks. If you want a good heat sink on the cheap, the Hyper 212 Evo is still a really good choice for builds and layouts like this. It won't crowd the RAM slots too much. It'll work fine on this particular board. Noctua also has some really good cooling solutions, but again, just depends on your preferences. If you're getting something that is not a clear brand, just try to make sure that it's got a copper base and copper heat pipes. Here we can see that even though these heat sinks are modest, they do actually have heat pipes to help conduct the heat up into the heat sink. And so this will probably be good enough, although these would be louder than I like. And depending on where I put the computer, if it is loud and annoys me, I'll replace these later. One thing about this giant board that wasn't exactly designed to fit in here is that I'm gonna have to reroute these cables. I don't think that this is gonna work with these cables. Let's do a test fit real quick. It might work. Get a little bit of clearance at the bottom there. Could probably stuff them down here and have it be fine. So strictly speaking, this motherboard wasn't really designed to fit in this case. So if you find a different motherboard, you're gonna have to do a lot of searching and careful lining up of pictures and stuff to make sure that your motherboard will fit. I happen to have this case, which is leftovers from another project. This case was actually damaged by UPS, but then I got another case later that somebody dropped, and so I sort of combined the parts, and it's like, ta-da, case again. What happened? So again, the name of the game here is to do test fits. Now you don't want to drag the motherboard around on your pegs. That would be bad. Okay, so we can see a few of those line up, but not many. Now, since we're going to have to mount our own holes, there's a bunch of things with that. One, you have to be really accurate. You've got less than 1 millimeter of tolerance here to deal with. And so I've got a piece of scrap steel that's basically a hard drive cage from another case, and we're going to use this as kind of a test. And so I've already located the stuff that we're going to need, and the stuff that we're going to need is we got an 1/8 inch drill bit. This is actually just a hair less than 1/8 of an inch because it's designed for tapping, but I think an 1/8 of an inch drill bit will work fine. And then we've also got our tap. This is from just sometimes it's called a tap and die set. Basically this just takes a hole that you've drilled out and puts threads in it, and then we've got our motherboard standoff. So I've sort of kind of already done this test. So basically you just start by putting your drill bit in your drill, and then you don't want to rush it, because if you rush it, you'll accidentally break your drill bit. Now these little tiny pieces of metal are bad. You're going to want to vacuum those out of your case, because if one of these tiny little pieces of metal makes its way onto your motherboard is destroyed, and that's bad. Now I would suggest that you tap by hand, meaning that you turn this by hand, you don't put it into a power tool. I'm a lazy person, so I'm going to use a power tool. And what that does is that adds threads to the hole. Now the next thing that you're going to need is a screwdriver that fits those really well. You don't have to, but I just find this step is really useful. And so now we've got our test motherboard standoff. We're just going to see if it threads into the hole without too much headache. Now, sometimes it can be problematic to get it started, but once you got it started, you know, you should be in good shape. And because we did these holes ourselves, you don't want to over tighten it, because if you over tighten it, you could strip the hole. But that's pretty much it. So let's do it for real. All right, so what we're gonna do, since we got so few holes that line up, I'm gonna use a small punch to mark holes that we need. Now this is normally a much more precision operation. This actually would be better done if I actually screwed in the motherboard with the holes that did align, because the alignment of these holes is pretty critical. These three, that one line up just fine. So it's really just these two, that one, and that one, and that one. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's kind of hard to see because Corsair used a very nice matte black finish that absorbs all the light. So no matter how much light you're using, it's never enough light. But you can see the little divots here. There's a low place in the metal. By sort of banging on that, we've created a low place that our drill bit will naturally go to. Nonetheless, it can still be tricky to prevent your drill bit from moving around. And remember what I said, the accuracy here is less than a millimeter, which is really hard to do with a hand drill. So be sure to practice on other stuff. Now I'm going to air compressor this out later, but it will be a pain in the ass to shoot that on video. So for now, I'm going to remove the large pieces with tape. All right, so just like before, be really, really careful lining this up. You want to sort of move the drill bit around until you feel it click into the place that you made with the tool. It's sort of good that it's low. And I'm going to support this with my finger, making sure that it's well away from the drill bit. Tap, tap. Hopefully it didn't tap too much. So if you do screw this up, fortunately the steel is thin enough that you could stick through a nut and have a nut sticking out the other side. So if you do screw up, just take one of these, go to the hardware store, and get a nut that fits on the back of it, and use your socket driver to tighten the nut down. You'll be fine. All right, here comes the moment of truth. Let's make sure I don't install the I/O shield upside down. Unfortunately, you run into this sometimes with older hardware. I got Q code 97 on this motherboard, which is a UEFI initialization problem in this case. The Radeon RX 480 is not compatible with the UEFI on this motherboard because it's a very early UEFI, because it's older hardware, and so of course the bugs in the UEFI mean that it won't boot. Not a big deal if you encounter this. If you try to turn on UEFI, just disable UEFI and it'll boot normally. As I'm going to be using this for a Linux workstation, it doesn't really bother me too much to use legacy boot mode, so that works fine. I was able to finally get this thing to boot by setting everything to UEFI except the graphics option ROM, and then everything boots normally. So that's good. Because I do a lot of different things, I'm going to configure a bunch of different drives here. I'm probably going to have a Windows drive to boot and play games, and maybe a Mac OS drive to boot and fiddle around with things there. So, but Linux is going on my 500 gig Samsung SSD, which just got a firmware upgrade. These Samsung SSDs, I want to like them, but they're plagued with firmware problems. Now, one thing I had to do because of the Radeon graphics card is install in troubleshooting mode, which has reduced graphics. But clearly I can see that nobody tried installing Fedora 24 in reduced graphics mode, because it's actually hard to do things because everything's larger than the screen. So yeah, it's a little tricky. That's okay. Hopefully they'll fix that. We'll deal with it. Of course, the other option would be to boot it in VNC mode, inst.vnc, but I'm not actually sure how to do that in the Fedora 24 installer. I need to be able to modify the command line on the boot line, but that's maybe a story for another day. Now that we've had our way with Fedora, it's time to test Ubuntu. Now, Fedora had a pretty much ready-to-use kernel 4.7, however, Canonical did not really have a usable version of kernel 4.7, so we're forced to build it on our own. But that gives us a chance to let this thing really stretch its legs, because we started 17 Linux kernel compile jobs in parallel. Well, we're making the kernel, and it has 17 jobs running in parallel. So right now our CPUs are running at just about 3 gigahertz. So we've got one, maybe 2 graphics cards if we're gonna run, you know, maybe we're gonna run Linux virtual machines like my hardware pass-through. So maybe we'll run not 1 but 2 graphics cards. Although if we were gonna run 2 graphics cards, I'd probably use 1 graphics card that's on full height. And you see this motherboard has 7 expansion slots, but you know, a graphics card is dual height. What are we gonna do so we could use all 7 cards? Because we're actually gonna have a lot of expansion cards here. You know, we've got our sound card, we've got our USB 3 card, we've got our NVMe Intel SSD. You know, we're starting to get kind of full here, and these guys will take up 2 slots. What do you do? So, well, that's the other reason this Corsair case is awesome, is because you can actually have the card hang off the bottom of the motherboard. So you've got these extra slots here at the bottom, and so we're going to put the graphics slot in the very bottom. Now, the white slots use CPU 0, and the black slots use CPU 1, so, you know, we've got a total of 80 PCI Express lanes here. So it literally doesn't really matter. We can just slam this stuff in anywhere, and basically it'll be fine. Alright, so check out another possible card layout. We've got our USB 3 adapter here, along with our front panel cable that's going off to the front panel. And then we've got our double height slot here, so we can stick another graphics card, our sound card. We've got a spot here for our NVMe SSD. And then we've got our second full-size graphics card. Now, if I was going to use a smaller graphics card for the primary graphics card, or if I was going to use the onboard VGA for Linux, then I would still have plenty of PCI Express connectivity in the rest of the system. Check it out, even an NVMe SSD is supported, even for a bootable device. But the Intel NVMe SSD does work in this as long as you've got the CSM parameters set in BIOS. Check it out from the BIOS setup utility. Now, I had to set legacy only for the video option ROM, but in order to work with the UEFI, I set it to UEFI only for all the other things. And then once I had set that up, come over here, and we've got our boot override. Now overall, I love this thing. Yeah, it's not the fastest, and yeah, a Skylake system can run circles around it if you're going to run the Adobe suite or whatever. But me, I'm running Linux. I'm going to run Windows under a virtual machine. The gaming performance is fine for what I'm going to be able to squeeze out of a 390 or an RX 480 or maybe even a Fury. It's completely fine. I think it's great. You know, GTA is fine. All the other games that I play operate pretty well. I can dual boot back into Windows if I really, really want to. The NVMe works. I got no complaints. It's a great system. It's a great system, and it's a really, really good deal. But yeah, it is used hardware, and you shouldn't necessarily run out to buy one. You should only really do this if an opportunity presents itself. You can get a good deal on a good motherboard. If you built something like this, or you're having fun or thinking about it or toying with the idea, or hell, maybe you're going to go hybrid. You're going to put one of these 2670s in an X79 motherboard. You could do that too. That gives you a little bit more overclocking options. I want to hear from you in the forum at techsyndicate.com. I'm Wendell. I'm signing out, and I'll see you later.